Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. This time, we're going to be talking about Nazis on drugs. So, this was something that I brought up in the last video. Been on a bit of a World War II kick these days. And this was always something that I heard that, oh, did you know the Nazis took meth? Did you know they were on methamphetamine? And, they were all hyped up on drugs and all this stuff. And I just don't know if that's true. I always, it sounds a little ridiculous. So thankfully our friend Indy Nidell is here with a two-part video. I'm going to cover both parts in this one video of Hi Hitler, Nazis on crystal meth, and then talking about the German army as well. So this again is not a topic that I'm terribly familiar with. I don't know much about narcotics. And to be honest, I always kind of doubted this topic because, it sounds a little ridiculous, but we're about to find out how true it was. Also, how do you like the new layout? Our friend Kristof made this, so if you like it, let me know. I'm going to put a link to his Twitch in the description. And without further ado, like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. We're getting there. We're 20% of the way to 1,000 subscribers. So if you could subscribe, it would really help. So without further ado, let's get right into this. Boom.
Imagine an army of 18 million men led by a ruthless demagogue high on speed, cocaine, and adrenaline. What could go wrong?
What could go wrong? Yeah, good question. Fantastic channel here, by the way. World War II.
I'm Indy Nidell. This is a World War II in real-time special. Now, it is often pointed out that Hitler, Adolf Hitler, whatever his shortcomings, was a vegetarian, didn't drink alcohol but preferred herbal tea, and was a non-smoker, even a fervent anti-tobacco activist.
Yeah, and actually people of Hitler's staff were not allowed to smoke around him. And this was during a time when obviously almost a lot of people smoked, much more than the modern time, and he found it to be a disgusting habit. I remember there was a quote when Hitler was running for office initially. And I don't remember who was it said it, but this is in the book by Ian Kershaw. He said, "How am I supposed to make Hitler a bohemian vegetarian popular?" Right, sort of making fun of Hitler and his sort of strange, habits that he had, especially for the time.
All of that is true, but that does not change the fact that his record shows much more disturbing personality traits. In fact, let's just say it how it is. Adolf Hitler was not a very stable guy.
Shocking.
Beyond the stupefying amount of mass murder he initiated, the crazy wars, and his complete absence of compassion and empathy with his victims, yes, Hitler vacillated between being a very gentle and sympathetic host in private to throwing tantrums and screaming like a furious baby at his generals and the rest of the Nazi Party leadership when he did not get things like he wanted. From listening attentively to advice and making quick and accurate conclusions with a steadfast resolve, to irrationally changing his mind and his plans based on inaccurate conclusions against the explicit advice of all his experts. From waxing lyrical about absurd dreams of greatness to which he would propel Germany, to despondently foreseeing the demise of his own person and the entire German culture.
True.
From extolling his own amazing powers and abilities to whinging about a number of real and imaginary symptoms of disease he thought he was suffering from, imaginary disease he often believed he had contracted from the Jews, by the way. Now,
of course he did. And just those comparisons, the from to comparison, I find that really fascinating because more than 70 years on now, and we're still talking about the men, right? I mean, there's just such a fascination, and I think that all of World War II, and I think everyone watching this is fascinated in some way, and that some of the central characters, Stalin and Roosevelt, and Churchill and Hitler and Mussolini, right? I find we have some sort of strange cultural fascination with these men of power and those who made decisions, right? And yeah, I mean, he's such a fucking sorry to swear. I try not to swear too much on this channel, but such a weird character that just all over the place personality wise, and yet there's just this fascination that persists.
Can diagnose Hitler and theorized that the reason for all of this was that he was simply nuts, a sociopath hypochondriac.
I think that's too easy of an explanation.
Or
though.
perhaps you think he was really a sickly, suffering man that was just doing what he needed to achieve his goals. A ruthless but rational mass-murdering dictator. Or you can...
And I think that saying that he was mentally ill is sort of a cop-out in a way. It sort of divorces him from his responsibilities and the things that he did, but that's a whole other topic.
Come up with any number of theories about his pathology. We shall never know, as we cannot actually diagnose the man posthumously with any reasonable accuracy. And as we shall see, his medical records have a serious flaw, namely his doctor's total incompetence as a man of medicine. But we do know one thing for a fact that surely contributed to his instability starting at the latest in 1936 and up until his death. He was a meth head. Well, wait. He was actually an equal opportunity dope fiend with an impressive daily intake of a great variety of psychoactive drugs. The origin of this mess was that doctor I mentioned, who was also Hitler's confidant and on-staff drug dealer, Dr. Theodor Morell.
Absolutely disgusting character, and I'm sure we'll get more into him, but just a piece of work, to say the least.
In the late summer of 1936, Adolf Hitler was suffering from intermittent, debilitating stomach cramps. His personal photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann, referred him to a certain Dr. Morell, whom Hoffmann claimed had saved his life. Morell was a socialite physician that had used his wife's fortune, she was the famous actress Hannelore Müller, to set himself up with a fashionable, super-equipped luxury practice where he treated the rich and famous, specializing in skin and venereal diseases. He had a preference for alternative medicine that had questionable efficacy, but he soon learned to spike his otherwise useless cures with psychoactive drugs that at least made his patients feel better pretty much immediately, albeit short term. Since many of the preparations he administered were highly addictive, it also had the effect of creating a faithful, ever-growing, returning patient roster.
I'm not going to get too into, obviously this is not a video about pharmaceuticals, but that's funny. He had a business plan. He had a business plan to further enforce his practice.
So in 1936, Dr. Morell examines the Fuhrer and gives him a cocktail of drugs, vitamins, and bacterial cultures that supposedly cure Wolfie's stomach cramps and makes him feel just great. Hitler is so elated that he makes Morell his personal physician on the spot. He also proceeds to recommend him, well, more like foist him, on the rest of his inner circle. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect, who is perhaps at this point the closest thing to a personal friend the Fuhrer has, soon suffers from similar stomach cramps. This is how Speer later describes the event. In 1936, when my circulation and stomach rebelled...
And that photo, actually, that was upon his capture, and that was really at the end of the war. It's actually quite a famous photograph, but you can just see the despair that's really in his face, and, you know, maybe realizing some of the consequences of his actions.
I called at Morell's private office. After a superficial examination, Morell prescribed for me his intestinal bacteria, dextrose, vitamins, and hormone tablets. For safety's sake, I afterward had a thorough examination by a real internal medicine specialist. I was not suffering from any organic trouble, he concluded, but only from nervous symptoms caused by overwork. I slowed down my pace as best I could, and the symptoms abated. To avoid offending Hitler, I pretended that I was carefully following Morell's instructions, and since my health improved, I became for a time Morell's showpiece.
Of course, and that's that groupthink mentality that was so present, especially near the end of the war, of people not willing to challenge Hitler, especially those within his inner circle. Yeah, so there you go. Just another example of groupthink really taking a toll on true leadership.
Hermann Goering and Heinrich Himmler are somewhat suspicious of their leader's pet chemist. Eventually, part of the treatment is an injection of what Morell calls Vitamultine, which Morell claims is just glucose and vitamins, which he administers to Hitler when he's feeling groggy. Himmler snatches one of those golden bags, and they are literally golden bags, and has SS physician Ernst Günther Schenk analyze the content. It turns out to be mostly methamphetamine. They are a bit alarmed, and hey, Goering should know, he himself is a recurring heroin and morphine addict who has been in and out of rehab since the Great War, where he became addicted to medicinally prescribed heroin and morphine in the first place. But it's the Fuhrer, you know, so who's going to tell him? Well, no one is going to tell him, because it's better to have a meth head as your leader than to lose your own head. But they do conclude that the doctor is indeed a quack, and they themselves stay clear of Morell. The Fuhrer, on the other hand, does continue to follow Morell's prescriptions, and by the early 1940s, the doctor is taking Hitler on a daily roller coaster of uppers and downers, meth and testosterone in the morning, cocaine and adrenaline during the day, barbiturates and bromide in the evening to take the edge off and let him sleep. All of this is rounded out with a mixture of antispasmodics, anti-inflammatory medicine, and regular vitamins. Morell writes
This guy was like a pharmaceutical cocktail.
down his regimen meticulously in his patient records, and doctors analyzing his notes after the war will conclude there doesn't seem to be much physically wrong with Hitler's health at this point, other than that he's an addict, of course. Now, the side effects of addiction tend to be a number of things you maybe don't want in a leader, such as erratic behavior, emotional instability, lack of focus, irritability.
And these photographs, these were actually taken by Hoffman, and they were ordered to be destroyed because it was Hitler trying out poses, and this I think was in the late 20s, I want to say, and they were ordered to be destroyed because, you know, they look a little silly. They look very silly. And but they were actually kept, and they were later released.
Drowsiness.
Yeah, I mean, look at this.
And delusions, just to mention a few.
Yeah, come on.
Now, considering that Hitler had displayed some worrying signs of suicidal depression already in the 1920s, was at times described as manic many years before Morell came along, and was, as is clear from his own writings, pretty seriously delusional from the get-go, this cannot be a good thing. More than anything, the Nazis have a potential press relations disaster here. You see, the wholesome image of Hitler as a healthy, non-smoking, teetotal vegetarian, far above the intoxicated masses, was a key motivator of the Fuhrer's cult of personality.
True.
In theory, drug abuse in the Third Reich was strictly illegal. Drug addicts and drug dealers faced draconian punishments. For them, it was cold turkey, and if you happened to not be part of the master race, it was into a cold train wagon and straight off to concentration camp. In many cases, drug addicts considered belonging to a lesser race were
I am a race shamer.
Even euthanized under the T4 program. The anti-drug propaganda was even merged into the Nazi anti-Semitic tropes by equating Jewish businesses with drug rings and declaring it all as part of the same toxic brew. The Nazi wonderland of Aryan heroes, the Fuhrer's children, did not, supposedly, indulge. However, in reality, it was, as Norman Ohler says in the beginning of his book, Blitzed, Drugs in Nazi Germany, National Socialism was toxic. And Ohler means that quite literally, because in contrast to the propaganda message, the Nazis themselves were not just addicts like Hitler and Goering, but also among the, and possibly the, biggest drug dealers in the world at the time.
My God.
I am not making that up, nor am I just sensationalizing, and that is what we will look at in our next episode of Nazis on Crystal Meth. In case you're just discovering us, in our regular episodes, we cover...
Yeah, and I'm sure most of you guys know about this channel, World War II, fantastic. They do week by week, great videos, highly recommend them, but that was a hell of an ending. So let's go check in with part 2 then, that talks about the German soldiers and had their drug use as well, and allegedly being the biggest drug operation in the world at the time. That's crazy. All right, let's get into part 2. All right, part 2, let's get right into it.
Nazis on Crystal Meth, part 2.
What a title.
A horde of drug-crazed meth heads coming after you. Now imagine these meth heads armed to the teeth with machine guns, howitzers, fighter planes, and tanks. Now imagine that the meth heads are being given orders by another meth head with a history of murderous instability. That's pretty much what happened in Poland, Scandinavia, the Benelux countries, and France in 1939 and 1940 when the Wehrmacht invaded.
Wow, okay. So one thing that I do know, one thing that's infamous is the Panzer Schokolade, which you can see in the bottom left corner here. Um, yeah, the Panzer Schokolade, I think, has amphetamines in it, I think. But the German army, or sorry, the Finnish army, because a friend that I'd met in Finland, he was in the Finnish army. They give them this chocolate as well, and although it's not mixed with amphetamines or anything, it has a lot of caffeine in it. And I was able to try one, and yeah, it really hypes you up. So I guess this sort of chocolate with some sort of stimulant is still being used to this day.
I'm Indy Nidell. This is a
No, sorry. He was in the Finnish army, but the chocolate was from the German army. Sorry.
World War II in real-time special. In the first episode of this two-part special feature, we had a look at Hitler's multi-drug addiction. But you know how it is, right?
Walking
As is the
pharmaceutical
leader,
cocktail.
so are the followers. Here's the thing. Before and during the Great War, it was German pharmaceuticals that created the patents for narcotic drugs like heroin and morphine and
Really?
painkillers like aspirin.
Wow, I did not know that.
Companies like
Huh.
Bayer, Merck,
Fascinating.
Boehringer, and the giant IG Farben quickly rose to become the dominant players on the
stimmt.
worldwide drug market. As these drugs really hit the German domestic market post-war, Berlin turns into a literal sin city. A whole generation scarred by the war descends into a drug-induced orgy. Cocaine, heroin, morphine, sex with anyone, endless parties in thousands of nightclubs, drug dens, and brothels carry them through dark years of defeat into what are called the Golden 20s.
Yeah, and the Weimar Republic too, at this point in time, was actually one of the most progressive places on the planet. I mean, homosexual relations were somewhat normalized during this time, again, for the 1920s, guys, right? As well as, yeah, as it said here, right, women's rights, other sorts of progressive issues at the time was really encapsulated in the Weimar Republic, which is quite fascinating, which obviously saw a huge backlash later during this time, as well as a multitude of other reasons why the Weimar Republic failed. Maybe that's another video we'll get into at some point. But yeah, interesting point of maybe narcotic use would have been higher at this point than maybe in, I don't know, in Chicago in the United States or something.
The mid-20s financial boom years fueled in part by the huge exports of drugs made in Germany.
Right, and the other thing too is prohibition's going on at this time. In Weimar Republic, that never happened. So
by 1925, when the rest of the world was banning these substances, Germany was the uncontested world leader in opiates like heroin and alkaloids like cocaine.
Crazy.
In some years,
Didn't know that.
they bought the entire yearly Peruvian production of coca paste and produced 40% of the global cocaine output. In 1929, it was Hamburg, not Sinaloa, that was the hub of the global cocaine trade.
Wow. Okay. Cool. Did not know that.
All good things.
I feel like a true reaction video here because I'm literally just saying, cool, I didn't know that. And I'm not adding in my typical commentary.
The government agrees to criminalize most opiates and alkaloids in 1930. 3 years later, the Nazis seize power, and they continue to use heroin and cocaine as illicit drugs, but now there's light on the horizon for the German legal drug trade. Synthetic barbiturates and a new wonder drug are about to create another pharmaceutical boom. In 1934, the pharmaceutical company Temmler started experimenting with a synthetic drug that is not on the list of banned substances, methamphetamine, what will later become crystal meth. Working for Temmler out of a bungalow on...
So this is where my knowledge is lacking, but then how does methamphetamine become crystal meth? I don't know. Maybe you guys can let me know in the comments here. I do not have a lot of knowledge about this.
Tempelhof Airport lot, Dr. Hauschild, the Walter White of Nazi Germany, Walter Weiss, right? The Walter Weiss. Okay,
nice.
The Walter Weiss of Nazi Germany, which are words I don't think anyone's ever said in a sentence before, develops a drug based on meth that is patented in 1937 under the name Pervitin. It's a huge hit, marketed as a wonder drug that will help you be a more efficient worker, a better student, a more caring mother. It will induce weight loss, and apparently it can even help overcome frigidity. Seeing that it is...
So, I guess just during this whole period of time that what we consider narcotics today were just prescribed as sort of health remedies in a way. I remember my grandmother. She had a dental operation done in the 60s, or sorry, in the 50s, and she was given liquid cocaine for painkillers. So I guess this was just much more common than we have today.
Becoming mother's little helper in many German households, Temmler increases its feminine appeal by making a high-dose version, 5 times the normal amount, injected into one chocolate praline. In reality, Pervitin is just a lesser, cheaper to produce, non-crystalline form of crystal methamphetamine. But it does deliver on the promise of giving you a
what does it taste like?
Serious boost of energy, keeping you awake for hours on end, cutting your appetite, and cutting down your inhibitions.
Crazy.
But it does have some nasty side effects, like depression, delusions, well, a whole slew of physical problems, not to mention that it is extremely addictive. As it happens, I myself have tried Pervitin. This is true, right? Really? Yep. This was over a quarter of a century ago when I lived in Prague. Now, the locals called it Pico. That was what Pervitin was called. Yeah. I can tell you that it is not an overall pleasant experience. Sure, you feel really good and speedy for a few hours, and you can stay up all night, and you really don't give a damn about any future consequences, but then you feel like an absolute train wreck. I mean, just destroyed for like 3 times longer than the fun part. The longest, worst hangover you can imagine.
Jeez.
Taking Pervitin.
So does that mean, sorry, this is just, maybe you guys can help me out here in the comments. So that means that Pico, is this now illegal? Is this still a legally made substance? What is the history here of, like, is this still happening? I don't know. Maybe you guys can help me out here.
It was sort of a trend in Prague back then. And some people who got really into it began shooting it, began injecting it. None of those people.
I like how he sounds incredibly off script here.
I have no idea why anyone would choose to take this drug. Anyway,
jeez, they were all,
when World War II breaks out, a significant portion of the Wehrmacht will march into battle jacked up on that very drug. Development of performance-enhancing drugs in the German army starts when Professor Dr. Otto Reinke becomes head of the Institute for General and Military Physiology in 1937. It is his job to look for ways to protect the German army soldiers from external factors with appliances like anti-dust goggles for motorcycle drivers or bulletproof helmets for the tropics. In other words, he develops gadgets. At the Militärärztliche Akademie, the Military Medical Academy, he starts to look for ways to beat fatigue, which in his mind is enemy number 1 for a soldier. Fatigue has the power to decide the outcome of the battle. In battle, the endurance of a soldier in the last 15 minutes are essential.
True, and I can only speak to that out of my own experience of being in the Canadian Army as a reservist for a long time now. Yeah, when you're, as we call it, sleep, right? You can fill in the rest. Oh man, I mean, you can start to hallucinate, right? Anyone who stayed up for a while knows this. But then when you're working the whole day, then you have to stay up all night because you have a stand 2 or something like this, right? For us, it was just, simulation. But for these guys, and on both sides, obviously, this was a reality that fatigue it can be the difference between life and death.
1938. He reads a paper on Pervitin.
Whether meth is whether Pervitin is the answer, though, that is a different question. But I think the Canadian Army runs on cigarettes and monsters, so
And starts to test it on cadets at the academy in Berlin. Not astonishingly, under the influence of Pervitin, the cadets are more awake. He notes after 10 hours of studying and concentration, they even feel like going out afterwards.
Of course.
While the ones on caffeine or a placebo have long fallen asleep with their heads on their desks. Also, shocking. Not very astonishingly, Reinke notices that cognitive capabilities decrease under the drugs. He concludes, Pervitin keeps people awake, but does not make them smarter. Ideal for soldiers, he figures. In fact, Pervitin tablets are already used by the soldiers on their own initiative during the occupation of Czechoslovakia in 1938. But by September 1939 and the invasion of Poland, the military has worked with Temmler to develop the assault pill, and it's a hit. From April to December 1939, Temmler delivers 29 million tablets to the German army. By May 1940, the pill is an integral part of the Blitzkrieg, seen as a pharmacological wonder weapon. During the 6-week invasion of the Benelux countries and France, over 35 million pills are consumed by the Wehrmacht.
35 million pills. And as we saw in the army group sizes video, good God, that would mean, so how many? There was about 3.1 or 3.7 million German troops that invaded France during this time. So that's, wow, that's quite a lot of pill popping.
Put Pervitin into candy bars, known as Flieger Marzipan for pilots and Panzer
Flieger
Schokolade
Marzipan
for tank crews. And
Panzer
the soldiers
Schokolade.
love it.
Stimmt.
Alert, indefatigable, the pills reduce fear and allow the user to perform combat duty, such as killing people, without emotional restraints. Troops stayed fresh and cheerful. Their discipline was solid. They were even lightly euphoric and had a heightened urge to perform their duties. It doesn't take long, though, for the euphoria to wear off.
That was going to be my next question, but then how sustainable is this?
Literally. Reinke is already suspicious of his own research. As his tests were not that extensive and not very long-term, he now suspects that he might have created a serious problem. And he's right. Beyond the obvious issues with addiction, other disturbing effects become apparent when deployed in millions of doses to fighting men like this. A day after taking the drug, the soldiers are in much worse physical condition, suffering circulatory disorders, even heart failure, and there are unintentional lethal overdoses. Luftwaffe accidents increase dramatically, and soldiers have to recover for days when they come off the pills.
Right, because I mean, as he just said, you know, it doesn't, sure, it makes you more awake, but it doesn't make you smarter. And to pilot a plane, right, you need to be thinking in your head here. I mean, even to be an infanteer, right, you still need to have some critical thinking skills and some sharp thinking, and even in those fatigue ridden moments.
So in net effect, it's decreasing efficiency and is responsible for the unpredictable, aggressive behavior that many men display, undoubtedly causing even more death and suffering than the war does ordinarily. In some cases, the use of meth immediately impacts combat performance negatively. One historian tells how, later in the war, 100 Waffen-SS infantrymen surrendered to their enemy without a fight. You see, they are out of machine gun ammunition before they have even engaged the enemy. Apparently, the night before, they had gone into a collective methamphetamine psychosis, imagined that they were being attacked, and fired everything they had at nothing. Several other belligerents,
I hope that's a true story,
used this drug as well, but under much more controlled circumstances. The Wehrmacht also decides to try to control Pervitin, reducing the purchase from 12.4 million pills a month to just 1.2 million pills a month by December 1940.
Interesting.
Although many soldiers will now have it sent from home.
Heinrich Böll asking his parents for Pervitin. Oh, that's funny. So he's trying to have it. Okay.
The official use will be restricted for special needs.
Illegally.
One of the demanding jobs that Pervitin will continue to make easier to deal with is the mass murder of prisoners of war and civilians, especially Jews.
Especially when you don't need to think.
In case you're just discovering us, in our regular episodes, we cover world...
Yeah, because I mean, if you don't need to think, then you don't need to consider your consequences. It's a fascinating book. I don't remember the title off the top of my head, but it's about a bunch of policemen that were in Hamburg, and they were actually one of the first killing squads in Poland. And fascinating book that talks about groupthink and how some people were given a choice to not do it. However, they all went ahead and did it, barring I think 2. And they talked about how after the first round of killing that they had to do in this village, where they cleared out a Polish village, that the amount of alcohol that they drank, they just couldn't stop drinking because they just had to numb it all up here. And so I would imagine that with something like Pervitin as well, combining that with alcohol, that, yeah, it's something that you need to not consider your own consequences. All right, so that was more of a reaction video than my usual commentary videos, I guess. Hope you liked it. Hope you found it informative. I hope I was able to provide enough commentary to make it interesting. Once again, like, comment, subscribe. Thank you all very much. And hey, now I know that Pervitin is a hell of a drug. Ciao.